So now we want to sharpen some of these rounded edges. And before we do that, there are a couple little minor housekeeping things that I like to look at mesh-wise with this model. And the first thing is the pole here, that at least this visible pole. And having all of these triangles at the top kind of makes this a really lumpy mesh. So for one that I'm going to keep rounded here, I'm just going to go through and select every other edge and go ahead and delete those. And then that's going to give us quads. They're actually direction changing quads, but they're still quads here at the top. And I'll just let that animate a little bit more cleanly. If we're going to do more with this, we'll actually look at doing something even a little bit different here in the center or at the top vertex, but for now, that one will work fine for there. Let's move then over to this spot here, where we need some sharpened edges to kind of make this a little bit more crisp. And really, we need to do two things. And the first thing is to subdivide this a little bit more heavily, and then the second thing is to create the rounded edges. So for something as low polygon as this, we're actually going to use a higher subdivision level. In this case, level, make sure we're in PSubs, yes. We're going to use level 4 subdivision. So at level 4, when I zoom in here, this should look really clean and smooth. We don't have any issues here. Now we have two options for the way that we create the sharpened edge here. So the first way is kind of the classic symmetrical loop slice, where we get a loop slice on either side, and those will kind of run around that rim and create a nice, relatively sharp edge. So let's have a look at that over here in the model view. Now I have my model view set up, or I like to set up my model view a particular way, and this is as good a spot as any to explain it. And that is to go into my options here, which I can just press O. Make sure that I have all of my locators, texture locators, lights, everything hidden. And then on drawing control, make sure that the wireframes are set to none. And also, here in the visibility, make sure that the work plane, the grid, all that stuff is hidden. And that way you can have a good clean OpenGL view, or you can click on RayGL and get a rendered view without having to have anything else in the way. So in this case, I'm actually going to go one step further, hide the light, and go to global illumination, turn off my ambient intensity, and just turn on indirect illumination. And that will allow me to get a nice, clean, rendered preview of what this is going to look like. So you can see this is working pretty well, but this is essentially as tight as I'm going to get this edge without going in and adding other supporting edges onto the rounded section of the sphere, which is actually going to be problematic. If I want to go in and add some extra edges along here, it's going to make this peel away more, or this socket peel away more from the inner sphere, and I don't really want that. So we're going to do a different thing here, and that's use edge weights. So I'm going to delete those extra edges and reselect this loop here, and then select the boundary by holding down Control and then clicking on Edges. So now I have those two boundary edges there ready. Go to the List tab and make sure that the subdivision weight map is selected, and then Shift W will put you into vertex weight map mode, or the tool. And this will allow you to make harder or sharper, or sharper or softer edges, and have a lot more control than you would as opposed to just adding in extra loop slices there. And one thing to remember is that the percentage of your weight is directly proportional to the actual mesh layer subdivision level. So in this case, we're looking at a subdivision level of 4. So multiply it by 10 to give you the right percentage to get a fully creased edge. So 40% is going to give me a creased edge. If I go any higher than that, it's not going to have any effect on the surface unless I increase the subdivision level. So if I want to have a just lightly rounded edge, I could go to something like 35%. You can see that's looking pretty nice. I can go down to 30% and get something very similar actually to the two loop sliced edges in there. And then I have good control over this. Now as I increase the subdivision level on that mesh layer, the difference that we get is actually going to become less pronounced because the percentage is going to accumulate here. So if I go up to a subdivision level of 5, you notice that 40% now is 4/5 or 80% of the way sharpened. Now if I go up to a level 6, it's not going to really get that much softer, or 7 or 8. it still isn't going to cause much of a difference. So I'm just going to go back to a subdivision level of 4 and set my weight map to 30%. And that'll give a nice, relatively sharp but lightly rounded edge. Again, we can hop over to the view that has everything turned off. Oops. And turn on our RayGL and get a good idea of how that rounding is going to look. This would also be a good place to go in and actually adjust the weights if you want to have an idea of how they're going to look shaded. So, for example, if I want to go up to 35%, and get a good idea of what that's going to look like in here. And in this case, I think I'll actually leave it there at 35%. And there you go. You have a nice way of previewing that and checking that as you move along. So now we'll have a look at a different model and using some rounded corners on an otherwise sharp object. So here is our next object. As I mentioned, relatively sharp corners. Okay, completely sharp corners. Yes, it is a simple 6-sided cube. The default cube shape, actually. And when we put this into PSubs, so Shift Tab, of course we get a kind of chunky looking ball. All right, and obviously this isn't going to be exactly what we want. Now, if I were to go ahead and just weight the edges, so let's go ahead and make sure we have our subdivision weight selected here, Shift W and add in the weight. Let's go to, again, 20% here first, because this is at subdivision level of 2 by default. I'm actually going to take this up to 40% because I'm also going to go here and increase the subdivision level to level 4. And that's going to give me completely sharp corners still. All right. Now, the problem lies in the position where one or more of these edges needs to be rounded. So if I were to select this edge here and lower my subdivision level, if I go all the way down to something like 0, it's going to work relatively well. And I'm going to have the nice crisp edge here that leads into that. And then it will work in okay increments. So if I go to, say, 10%, it's going to look relatively good. Again, 20% is probably going to look all right, a little rough, and so on and so forth. The closer I get to that full percentage, the more chunky this is going to look, and less convincing as being something that's actually usable. And you can see the way that bows as I go between about 10 and 15%. You can see that flexing there. So this is somewhere where we have to be specifically careful in how you do this. And even this one here at 10%, if we look here and get something like, say, the Gooch Tone shader, where I can see a little bit more of my instance angle, you can see there is definitely a bit of a flex there at that corner and some inflection in the surface. The reflection shader should show it as well. So you can see that's really not what we're going for. So there are a couple of things that need to happen in order to get some rounding and some otherwise sharp bits here. So let's go back to everything being at 100%, and I'm going to go back to my advanced OpenGL. Now, the thing is that PSubs, even though you can use weighted edges very, very well, in order to do either transitions or do sections that are completely weighted or sharply weighted versus sections that are not sharply weighted, there actually still is a need for supporting edges, much like previously doing PSubs doing subdivision surfaces where you would add in edge loops in order to sharpen up the corners. So let's go ahead and press Shift D to add just one level of subdivision into here. And now if I were to look at this, my vertex map has sharp all around the corners and then empty or no sharpness on these faces. All right, so this would allow you actually, let's go back to advanced OpenGL. This would allow you some interesting things if you want to move some of these vertices. So if, for example, I were to go to my vertices here and grab this one and pull it down, this is actually going to work very well. Okay, see, I can get that nice transition from hard into soft, and it works relatively well. Where this has difficulty is when we're trying to round without actually moving the vertices, which sometimes is something that is desired. So if you're looking at completely sharp edges here, this is going to be great. If you're looking at slightly rounded edges at a high subdivision level, also will work very well here. So if, for example, I step up to, let's go to level 6, and I'm just going to sharpen everything at the moment here. So let's just pull everything up to 60%, so we have a nice sharp edge here. This is going to work very well, and the benefit of working with something like this is that this makes a wonderful platform for sculpting. And since it has a very low polygon count, it's very easy to either step back on the subdivision or bake something from that, because we're dealing with only 4 polygons on each side, so a total of 24 polys here. So just to have a look at that, let's step over real quickly to the Paint tab, and I'm going to just turn on multi-res. And then with multi-res on, you can essentially just sculpt right on top of this with no real issues. So no problems here, and you can sculpt a little bit without much issue. You can also step up in subdivision, knowing that you are going to start to introduce some slightly rounded corners, which obviously could be all right depending on what you're working on, and then work at a higher level of sculpting. Of course, if you have a tablet plugged in, that will work significantly better. This also gives you the benefit of being able to adjust the edge weight using sculpting as opposed to just using weights. So if, for example, I were to just get a nice brush here and use my smooth brush, I could smooth this out and soften up this edge while leaving the other ones nice and hard. I could also use something like a tangent pinch and sharpen up the edges along here. Now, the benefit of doing this as opposed to going in and adding in extra edges in order to sharpen up the edges instead of using the edge weights is that you get a really nice amount of possibilities at your edges for sculpting without causing overlapping of edges and all sorts of weirdness that's going to give you render artifacts, weird shadows, and things like that. So for example, if I just grab the flatten brush here, I can work on these edges very, very nicely without having any of those issues with overlapping edges or anything like that. I could go and get something like this and kind of eat away here at the edges also. I could sculpt away on this all I want. And even at a subdivision level of 7, I'm only at about 800,000 polygons, so I could very easily step up another subdivision level and work on something even higher resolution here. And then I can always, of course, go and smooth in my details, and that gives you something very nice to work with. All right, so let's actually just back up here, and I'll just create a new box, and we'll hide that sculpted one. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and get us back to where that first one was. So we'll subdivide, step up to level 4, Shift W, and turn ourselves up to a weight of 40. Then Shift D to facet that and add in an extra set of edges. Now, the important thing is to have realistic expectations with what you're going to achieve with edge weighting. So if I want to, for example, round off this corner, so let's just pull down the subdivision weight. We'll pull it all the way down to 0 here. This is going to be something that's going to be difficult to achieve, and that's because there is nothing as far as a transition goes. The weighting here is edge-based, not vertex-based, and so I'm not getting a clean transition between here and here. If I have more subdivisions and use a fall-off, then that could give me some nice, clean subdivisions here. However, I don't. I have one edge, a middle edge, and a back edge, and that's all I have. So the only transition can just go on an edge-to-edge basis. So if we look at the vertex map, we can see exactly what's going on here. We have fully weighted into nothing, and there's no way for a transition. And like I said, we could add in some subdivisions here and use a fall off. In fact, that's what we'll do in some other sections of this series. But for now, we have to think of what is a realistic goal here. And typically, the idea is going to be to keep entire loops together, and that will allow you to get something that actually works. So if I were to take this one here, and let's go ahead and fully weight that again. I'm going to pull that up to 40. And then I'm going to grab the whole top section here and just get the boundary. And on this part, I'm going to pull my weight down to something like 10%. You see, that kind of thing will work because we're getting a nice transition. What you will notice is we stay sharp at these corners. And let's actually go back to Advanced OpenGL to see that better. We've got sharp, 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 sharp all the way up to the corner. We do get the rounding around the top, but not so much around the rest of it. All right, so let's back up here, and I'm going to set everything up now to a full weight again. And then let's look at, again, another idea here would be as if we were to take these edges this way, which would be considered full loops because you see these terminate at top and bottom. And now I can weight these down and get something really nice. So let's pull down, if we go all the way to 0, if we go up, remember we will still get some of that flexing, and let's leave it here where we have a little bit of flexing and hop over to the vertex weight map, and you can see what exactly is going on here. And that's that we don't have enough weight in the middle to make this work well, and that's why we get some arcing here. So we could just take this middle here and pull the weight up is going to cause us more of that kind of undulation, because we have this edge with very little weight and the edges above it and below it with a lot of weight. So if I pull this back down and go to the same, I believe we're at 2% weight, that can help to kind of solidify that. But overall, you're going to have difficulties when you're working around loops like this and having really odd amounts of weight in between. So let's set that again back down to 0. Now I could take this and delete this edge, and that's going to help a bit, but still going to cause a bit of general weirdness. So let's undo that, keep that edge in there, and then look at what we can actually achieve here. So as was the case with the previous version where we worked with the various weights, you can see that there are going to be, you're going to have success at intervals here. So at 10%, for example, nice and clean. At 0%, nice and clean. 20%, probably doing pretty well. But then once you get to something where it's a higher fraction, like 3/4 of it, you might have a little bit more problems. And then that's also where you start to see the subdivision level breakdown. Remember, we're only dealing with 24 polygons here, or 48 triangles. So there's not a lot to tessellate, so you really see that here. And we're only at a subdivision level of 4, so this is only 12,000 polygons for the entire thing. So with this in mind, we'll now move on to actually creating the basic shape of our robot and giving it some initial kind of values to add weights and supporting edges to create a nice basic shape that can be used to derive a lot more for the finished geometry, and also be used to attach other more complex pieces into the base. So thanks, and I will see you in the next video.